My wife ordered our trained German Shepherd to attack my sister at a family barbecue. I've never been more proud. My wife stood up suddenly during our family BBQ and commanded our German Shepherd in a voice I'd never heard before. Zeus, attack. The dog launched himself at my sister, jaws locking onto her forearm as she screamed and fell backward off the picnic bench, blood immediately soaking through her shirt. I tackled Zeus off my sister while our kids ran inside crying, and my parents screamed at my wife, calling her a psychopath who should be locked up. My mother was on the phone with 911 sobbing that her daughter-in-law had weaponized a dog against her own daughter, while my father tried to stop the bleeding with dish towels that turned red instantly. My sister was writhing on the ground, screaming that my wife was insane and had always been jealous of her, while our cousins filmed everything and our 8-year-old daughter stood at the window watching her aunt bleed. I grabbed my wife's shoulders, demanding to know what the hell was wrong with her, why she'd lost her mind and attacked my sister who'd been nothing but helpful with our kids. The neighbors came running over and backed away when they saw the blood pooling on the concrete, one of them saying they'd testify that my wife commanded the attack unprovoked. My brother-in-law was hysterical, calling my wife an attempted murderer, while I stood there wondering if my wife had snapped from stress. That's when my wife finally spoke up. I found videos on Sophie's phone when she left it here last night, her voice shaking. What videos? I asked. She's been recording herself touching our children during babysitting. Everyone went silent except for my sister's moaning, and my wife continued quickly, showing footage that made my legs go weak. I found 6 hours of her making Olivia play special games, where she has to sit on her lap without clothes, and worse things with Ben that I can't even say out loud. The video showed my sister's hands where they should never be, while Olivia begged her to stop, and I felt like I couldn't breathe watching my sister tell our 4-year-old it was their special secret. I only found this at 3 a.m. when I was looking for my charger and her phone lit up with a notification, my wife continued, tears streaming down her face. I spent all morning trying to figure out what to do, called the police, but they said they'd need to interview the kids first, which could traumatize them more, and I tried to tell you, but you were setting up for the BBQ and said we'd talk later. I remembered brushing her off this morning when she'd seemed frantic, telling her whatever it was could wait until after the family party. Sophie had written notes about how she was going to frame me for the abuse. She has edited videos where you can only hear the kids crying, and she was planning to call CPS tomorrow morning with an anonymous tip that would have me arrested. My wife showed us pages from Sophie's journal she'd found in her overnight bag, filled with detailed descriptions of what she'd been doing to our children and her escalation plans. She wrote about wanting kids, but not wanting to ruin her body with pregnancy, and how our kids were perfect and would be better off with her once I was in prison. The pages included Sophie's step-by-step plan to plant evidence, her practice scripts for calling CPS, and notes about which bruises on the kids she could photograph to blame on my wife. But that's not even why I had Zeus attack her, my wife said, her voice breaking. Sophie had hidden recording devices in our bedroom and the kids' rooms last night, and when my wife found them this morning along with everything else, she realized we were hours away from losing our children. I found receipts on her laptop for a storage unit where she's been preparing a room for them, with their clothes and toys she's been stealing from our house for months. My wife showed us photos from Sophie's cloud storage of our children sleeping, hundreds of them, taken during babysitting when we thought they were safe. When I saw her arrive today and put her hands on Olivia's shoulders, whispering in her ear that they were going to have special time later, I knew I couldn't wait for the police because she was going to hurt them again, right here at our family party. Blood was running down my sister's arm as she pushed herself up from the ground, and I saw her face change when she realized everything was exposed. I felt sick, realizing I'd been letting a monster babysit our children, that every Thursday night when my wife had seemed anxious about leaving them with Sophie, there'd been a reason I'd ignored. The cousins were calling Sophie disgusting, and my father stood between her and the house where our children were hiding, while I tried to process that my little sister had been hurting my babies for months. The picnic table was right next to her with steaks we'd been about to grill, and the butcher knife we'd used lay within reach, still greasy from cutting meat. "You stupid itch," Sophie said to my wife, her voice different than I'd ever heard it, cold and flat. "Those kids love me more than you, and everyone would have believed me over some paranoid mother." Her hand started moving toward the knife handle. I saw Sophie's fingers getting closer to that greasy knife handle, and my body moved before my brain caught up. My foot connected hard with the edge of the picnic table, sending plates and the knife spinning into the grass 10 feet away. Sophie tried to lunge after it, but my brother-in-law grabbed her torn arm while I pinned her other side, both of us pushing her down into the grass. She was screaming that we didn't understand what we were doing, that my wife was the real danger to those kids. My wife's hands were shaking as she commanded Zeus to heel, her voice cracking but firm enough that the dog stopped growling and followed her. She led him toward the garage, his tail still rigid and his eyes locked on Sophie until the garage door closed between them. I could hear him barking and scratching at the door, the sound mixing with my mother's screaming. She was pulling at my brother-in-law's shoulders, demanding we let Sophie go, saying this was assault and we'd all go to jail. My father moved closer to the back door, planting himself like a wall between Sophie and the house where our kids were hiding. screaming. The cousins had their phones out, and I heard my cousin Mike telling someone on the phone to get over here right now because they wouldn't believe what was happening. Sophie kept twisting under us, blood from her arms soaking into the grass, and I used a voice I'd never used with my family before. Everyone shut up and listen to my wife. The yard went quiet, except for Sophie's moaning and cursing. I told my mother to stay on the line with 911, but to tell them we needed police, not just an ambulance. My wife pulled out Sophie's phone with shaking hands and turned the screen toward me. Just a quick glimpse, but enough. I saw my daughter's face, heard her small voice saying she wanted to stop, and my stomach turned inside out. I let go of Sophie and stumbled to the bushes, throwing up the beer and chips from earlier, while my brother-in-law kept her pinned with both hands. My mother was staring at the phone screen, her face going white as my wife scrolled through more evidence. I wiped my mouth and grabbed my mother's phone from her numb fingers, telling the operator we had evidence of child sexual abuse and needed police immediately. My voice cracked when I mentioned there was a journal with plans to frame my wife and hidden cameras in our house that needed to be collected as evidence. The operator said units were already on the way and to secure the scene. Sophie started talking over everyone, her voice high and desperate, claiming my wife had planted everything because she'd always been jealous of how close Sophie was with the kids. She said my wife was unstable, that she'd been planning this for weeks, that the dog attack proved she was dangerous. The neighbors who'd come running were whispering among themselves, and I saw Mrs. Peterson step back when Sophie mentioned the planted evidence. My wife didn't say anything, just flipped open Sophie's journal to a page covered in her handwriting and held it up. The neighbors leaned in to read it, and their faces changed from doubt to disgust. I couldn't stand there anymore, not with my kids alone and scared inside. I ran through the back door and up the stairs, finding their bedroom door closed. They were in the closet, Olivia holding Ben while he cried into her shirt. I locked their door from the inside and sat down next to them on the closet floor, telling them they were safe now and that Aunt Sophie was sick and getting help. The words tasted wrong in my mouth, like I was lying even though it was true. Olivia asked if Zeus was in trouble for biting Aunt Sophie, and I said no, he was just protecting them like a good dog should. Ben wouldn't look at me, just kept his face buried in his sister's shirt. I could hear sirens getting closer, and I told them we'd stay right here together until everything was okay. The paramedics must have arrived because I heard new voices in the yard, professional and calm, asking about the injury and how it happened. Through the window, I could see two police officers walking around the yard, one of them already talking to my wife, while the other kept everyone else back. Sophie's voice carried up to us, insisting she needed to explain everything properly, that this was all a misunderstanding. I heard an officer tell her to save it for her lawyer, and then the paramedic saying they needed to transport her for the arm injury. My wife's voice was steady as she handed over Sophie's phone and journal, showing the officers where she'd found the cameras in our bedroom that morning. She explained finding everything at 3 a.m. when she'd gone looking for her charger and Sophie's phone lit up. Sophie's sudden shift from screaming victim to cold confession has me wondering what made her drop her act so completely. Was it knowing she'd been caught, or something else? She told them about calling the police advice line at 6 a.m. and being told they'd need to interview the kids first. She mentioned trying to tell me at 9 a.m. when I was setting up tables and told her we'd talk after the party. The officer was writing everything down while my wife pointed to different pages in the journal, showing him the storage unit receipts and the screenshots she'd taken of Sophie's cloud storage. Sophie was loaded onto a gurney, her arm wrapped in white bandages that were already showing red spots, and I watched through the window as they wheeled her past the crowd of family and neighbors who'd gathered on our lawn. The first officer walked over to me while I stood at the window watching the kids still hiding in the closet. He pulled out his notepad and asked me to explain what happened from the beginning. I told him about my wife trying to talk to me this morning when I was setting up tables in the backyard. She'd grabbed my arm and said we needed to talk right away about something serious with Sophie. I'd brushed her off and told her whatever it was could wait until after the party because I had too much to do. The words tasted like dirt in my mouth as I admitted how I'd rolled my eyes when she kept insisting it was urgent. The officer wrote everything down while I explained how my wife had seemed upset all morning, but I thought she was just stressed about hosting. He asked if Sophie babysat often, and I said yes, every Thursday night for the past 2 years when we went to our couples bowling league. My wife had started acting weird about it lately, always finding excuses why we should skip bowling or hire someone else. I never listened because Sophie was family, and the kids seemed to love her. The shame made my chest feel tight as I remembered all the times my wife suggested we stay home instead. Our neighbor walked up to the officer next and started talking fast about what she'd seen earlier. She said she heard my wife yell the attack command clear as day from her kitchen window. She also mentioned seeing Sophie put her hands on Olivia's shoulders when they first arrived and thought it looked strange. Sophie had been whispering something in Olivia's ear, and the little girl had tried to pull away, but Sophie held her tight. The neighbor said she almost came over to check if everything was okay, but didn't want to cause drama at a family party. More officers arrived and started separating everyone to take individual statements in different parts of the yard. One of them told us CPS would be contacted immediately because of the nature of the allegations. He also said animal control had to be called about the dog bite, which made my stomach drop. I asked if they were going to take Zeus away, and the officer said that would be determined later, but for now, he needed to stay secured. The paramedics were lifting Sophie into the ambulance when she turned her head toward my wife, who was giving her statement by the fence. Sophie's eyes looked dead and cold as she said loud enough for everyone to hear that the kids were hers and would always be hers. The paramedic quickly pushed her all the way in and slammed the doors, but those words hung in the air, making everyone go quiet. Two officers went inside with my wife to look at the cameras she'd found in our bedroom and the kids' rooms that morning. They took photos of everything and put each camera in a separate evidence bag with labels. One officer asked my wife for her laptop so they could preserve the screenshots she'd taken of the storage unit receipts and all those photos from Sophie's cloud storage. My wife handed it over along with Sophie's phone and journal, which they also bagged as evidence. A woman in a gray suit arrived about an hour later and introduced herself as Detective Leah Wainwright. She took charge immediately and told the other officers this was now a major case requiring special handling. She had my wife sit down at the picnic table and walk through exactly when and how she'd found everything. A man with a laptop sat next to them, typing fast, while my wife explained finding Sophie's phone at 3 a.m. when she was looking for her charger. The detective asked specific questions about timestamps and had the tech guy check something called metadata on all the files. My wife showed them her call log from this morning when she'd tried the police advice line at 6 a.m. 2 hours after the attack, a man in a polo shirt with a CPS badge showed up and introduced himself as Carlos Pike. He explained that Sophie couldn't have any contact with any kids from now on and that our children would need something called forensic interviews. He was nice, but very clear that we couldn't ask the kids any questions about what Sophie did because it could mess up their testimony later. He gave us a card for someone named Ramona Conrad who would do the interviews at a special center designed for kids. Another man arrived with animal control written on his truck and said his name was Aziz Branch. He needed to look at Zeus's teeth and measure the wounds on Sophie's arm from the photos the paramedics had sent. He took pictures of Zeus through the garage window and wrote down a bunch of measurements in his notebook. He handed me papers saying Zeus had to stay home for 10 days and we'd have a hearing to decide if he was dangerous. The thought of losing our dog on top of everything else made me want to punch something. My parents were arguing in the driveway while everyone else started to leave. My dad was saying he'd noticed Sophie getting too touchy with kids at Christmas and other family events, but thought he was imagining things. My mom kept shaking her head and insisting there had to be some other explanation because her daughter couldn't be capable of this. She said maybe Sophie was sick or having a breakdown, but my dad told her to stop making excuses. That night, after everyone left and the police finished collecting evidence, my wife went to our bedroom while I grabbed a pillow for the couch. Neither of us could stand being in the room where Sophie had hidden cameras watching us sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling thinking about every Thursday night for the past 2 years. All those times my wife had suggested we skip bowling or said she had a bad feeling about leaving the kids. Every single time I'd told her she was being paranoid and that Sophie was great with them. The weight of my stupidity pressed down on me like a truck on my chest. My phone started buzzing on the coffee table at dawn and I grabbed it to see my dad calling, which was weird since he never called this early. He sounded different when I answered, older somehow, and told me he'd been up all night making a list of every time Sophie had volunteered to watch other family members' kids over the past 5 years. He remembered our cousin Janet's twins, our neighbor's daughter when they lived next door, the Mitchell kids from church, and kept naming more families while his voice cracked in ways I'd never heard from him. I wrote down every name he gave me while he talked about birthday parties where Sophie always offered to supervise the kids in the basement, family reunions where she'd take groups to the playground, and how he should have seen the pattern, but just thought she liked being helpful. The list had 17 names by the time he finished, and he said he'd already left a voicemail for Detective Wainwright at 5:30 this morning because he couldn't wait any longer. My phone beeped with another call coming through, and it was Detective Wainwright herself, saying she'd gotten an emergency warrant signed by Judge Harrison to preserve all of Sophie's cloud storage accounts before anything could be deleted. She was heading to the storage facility on Route 9 with her team and a forensic specialist to document everything Sophie had been collecting, and she needed us to stay available in case they found anything requiring immediate clarification. I could hear car doors slamming in the background as she talked, and she mentioned they were bringing a child advocacy specialist to catalog any items that might be evidence of long-term grooming behavior. Carlos Pike called 20 minutes later while I was making coffee, reminding us that the kids had their forensic interviews scheduled for tomorrow morning with Ramona Conrad at the Child Advocacy Center downtown. He stressed again that we absolutely could not ask Olivia or Ben any questions about what happened, no matter how much we wanted to understand, because it could mess up their ability to testify later and even make their statements inadmissible in court. He said Conrad was the best in the state at interviewing traumatized children and had special training in cases involving family members as perpetrators, which made me sick to think about, but also grateful someone knew how to handle this properly. I heard my wife moving around upstairs and then her footsteps going toward the garage, where Zeus had been locked up up since yesterday's attack. Through the kitchen window, I could see her sitting on the garage floor talking to him through the door, and when I got closer, I could hear her apologizing for making him hurt someone, but thanking him for protecting our babies when she didn't know what else to do. She had her phone out recording herself as a voice memo, saying she might need to remember exactly why she gave that command when the lawyers started asking questions and Zeus was whining and scratching at the door wanting to be with her. She stayed there for over an hour just talking to him about how he was a good boy who did exactly what she needed, how none of this was his fault, and how she'd make sure nothing bad happened to him, even if she had to go to jail for what she did. Detective Wainwright called back around 9 to tell us they'd found the storage unit, and it was worse than we thought. The whole space was set up like a child's bedroom with Disney princess sheets on a twin bed, stuffed animals arranged on shelves, and bins labeled with our kids' names containing clothes she'd been stealing from our house for months. What's making me wonder right now is how Sophie had that whole storage unit set up like a kid's bedroom with clothes she'd been taking from their house. That takes serious planning, and nobody noticed things going missing for months. There were drawings Ben had made at preschool that we thought we'd lost, Olivia's favorite purple jacket that disappeared last winter, and even their toothbrushes in a bathroom caddy next to the bed. The forensic tech was photographing everything while another officer cataloged each item, and Wainwright said there was also a folder with printed screenshots of houses for sale in Oregon, where Sophie had apparently been planning to take the kids once she had custody. The tech guy examining Sophie's devices called Wainwright over, and she came back on the line to tell us he'd confirmed that all the timestamps on the videos matched the exact nights Sophie had babysat over the past year. The purchase records for the hidden cameras traced back to Sophie's credit card from 6 weeks ago, ordered online and shipped to the storage unit address, with installation instructions she'd printed out and highlighted. Every single piece of digital evidence pointed to months of deliberate planning, including web searches about how to avoid detection, which states had the weakest child protection laws, and forums where she'd asked for advice about documenting neglectful parenting to build a custody case. Detective Wainwright called again an hour later with news that made me run to the bathroom to throw up. They'd found Sophie's external hard drive hidden in the storage unit, and it contained more videos, some dating back over a year to when Ben was only 3. She wouldn't give specifics, but said the content was extensive enough that federal charges would definitely be added since Sophie had been creating and storing child exploitation material across state lines when she'd backed everything up to cloud servers. The detective said they were bringing in specialists from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit, and that this was now bigger than just our family. My phone rang again, and this time it was someone from my company's HR department who'd seen the local news coverage about the dog attack at a family gathering. She offered me emergency family leave effective immediately and said the company would provide counseling services for our whole family through their employee assistance program. She also warned that reporters had already called the main office trying to get comments from my co-workers, and that security had been told not to let any media onto company property. I was writing down the case numbers for the leave paperwork when another call came through from a blocked number. The man identified himself as Sophie's attorney and immediately started threatening a civil suit for the dog attack, claiming my wife had used excessive force and shown clear premeditation by commanding a trained attack dog to maim his client. He said Sophie had permanent nerve damage in her arm and might never regain full use of her hand, which would affect her ability to work and require extensive medical treatment and therapy. Before I could even respond, my phone beeped with another call from a number I didn't recognize, but the caller ID showed it was from the district attorney's office. Prosecutor Esteban Reardon introduced himself and told me not to say a single word to Sophie's attorney, that he was taking over the criminal case personally, and that the imminent threat Sophie posed to the children would be their main defense for my wife's actions. 3 days later, we drove to the Children's Advocacy Center for the forensic interviews, my hands shaking on the steering wheel while my wife held the folder of paperwork. Olivia asked why we had to go talk to strangers, and Ben just stared out the window sucking his thumb, something he hadn't done in 2 years. The building looked like a regular house from outside with a playground and bright painted walls, but inside my stomach twisted, knowing what my kids would have to describe. Ramona Conrad met us in the waiting room wearing jeans and a soft sweater instead of a suit, immediately getting down on the kids' level to introduce herself. She showed them the interview rooms with toys and art supplies, explaining they'd just be talking and playing while Mommy and Daddy waited nearby. My wife and I sat in a separate room with a two-way mirror where we could see but not hear, watching cartoons on mute while our kids went through their interviews. Olivia went first, sitting cross-legged on the floor with Ramona while they colored pictures and talked about safe touches and unsafe touches. I watched my daughter's face change when Ramona asked about Aunt Sophie, saw her shoulders tense and her coloring get harder on the paper. The interview took 3 hours with breaks for snacks and bathroom trips, and I had to leave twice to throw up when I saw Olivia demonstrating something with dolls. Ben's interview was shorter, but harder to watch because he kept trying to hide under the table when certain questions came up. Ramona stayed calm and patient, letting him take his time and using puppets to help him explain what he couldn't say with words. When she finally finally came out to the waiting room, Ramona looked professionally composed, but I could see the effect in her tight jaw and careful breathing. She said both children were very brave, and their statements were consistent with the physical evidence, which would help the case significantly. Carlos Pike arrived while we were gathering our things, pulling us aside to update the safety plan based on the interview findings. He explained that no extended family could have unsupervised contact until they completed background checks and approved training about recognizing abuse signs. This meant canceling Thanksgiving at my parents' house next week, and Christmas plans were now impossible until the case resolved. My mother called that night sobbing, finally breaking down about a memory she'd been avoiding since the barbecue. She admitted noticing bruises on Ben's thighs 6 months ago when she'd helped with bath time during a sleepover. Sophie had explained them as playground accidents from the monkey bars, and my mother had believed her without question. Now she was replaying every interaction, every moment Sophie was alone with the kids, wondering what else she'd missed or chosen not to see. She kept asking how she didn't know her own daughter was capable of this, how she'd raised someone who could hurt children. Detective Wainwright called the next morning with news that made me slam my fist into the wall hard enough to leave a hole. The digital forensics team had uncovered Sophie's activity in online forums where people attracted to children share strategies for gaining access. She'd been posting for over 2 years, asking for advice about becoming a trusted babysitter and avoiding detection by parents. The detective said Sophie had detailed conversations about grooming techniques, how to normalize inappropriate touching, and ways to discredit children if they tried to tell. These posts elevated the charges significantly because they showed clear premeditation and connection to a larger network of predators. Sophie was formally charged that afternoon with 12 counts, including sexual abuse of minors and production of child exploitation material. The prosecutor added conspiracy charges for her plan to frame my wife, plus federal charges for using interstate commerce to share abuse material. Her bail was set at $500,000, with conditions including GPS ankle monitoring and no contact with any minors. The judge also ordered her to surrender her passport and prohibited her from using any internet-connected devices. My wife and I started individual therapy the next week, sitting in separate offices at the same counseling center. My therapist immediately identified my pattern of dismissing my wife's concerns as keeping the peace behavior from my childhood. She helped me see how I'd been trained to minimize conflict, which predators like Sophie count on to continue their abuse. During our couples session afterward, we got a referral for Chaya Bergman, who specialized in helping child victims of family abuse. The receptionist called our insurance while we waited, confirming they'd cover unlimited sessions given the circumstances. Our lawyer warned us that the animal control hearing next week could go badly, despite Zeus following a legal command. The board might still designate him as dangerous, requiring a muzzle in public and expensive liability insurance. We spent the weekend gathering character references from neighbors, the vet, and the kids' teachers, who all wrote about Zeus's gentle nature. Our dog trainer provided certification records showing Zeus only responded to specific protection commands and immediately obeyed recall orders. During my second therapy session, I completely broke down describing how my wife had tried to tell me something was wrong that morning. I kept replaying her frantic expression while I waved her off, focused on arranging hamburger patties instead of listening. The therapist helped me understand that predators specifically count on this dynamic, choosing families where one parent dismisses concerns. She explained that Sophie had likely noticed this pattern and knew I'd be the weak link in protecting our children. Detective Wainwright discovered something that made the case even bigger when she found 2 other families who'd filed complaints about Sophie. Both families had used her as a babysitter through the same neighborhood app, and both had noticed concerning behavior but hadn't pursued charges. She was now interviewing those families to establish a pattern, though one family had moved out of state, which complicated things. The detective said Sophie had been testing boundaries with multiple children, seeing which families would be easiest to exploit. My parents started their own therapy to process how their daughter became a predator, meeting with a specialist in family trauma. My father admitted during their first session that he'd been having violent thoughts about Sophie, fantasizing about hurting her the way she'd hurt our children. The timing of Sophie's online forum posts going back 2 years makes me really curious about when she first started seeing the kids differently. Her lawyer calling about the dog attack while she's facing federal charges seems like such a strange priority right now. My mother still struggled with acceptance, bouncing between rage at Sophie and desperate attempts to find some explanation that wasn't her fault. The next day, Detective Wainwright called me to the station to go through Sophie's journal page by page, and I sat there for 3 hours reading my sister's handwriting, describe how she'd been grooming our kids. She'd written about recording Olivia crying during bath time and editing the audio to make it sound like my wife was hurting her, with notes about which bruises from normal kid stuff she could photograph as evidence. The detective pointed out dates matching when Sophie babysat and showed me receipts she'd found for audio equipment Sophie bought specifically to frame my wife. I kept having to stop reading because the person in these pages wasn't the sister who'd taught me to ride my bike when I was 7, or who'd stayed up all night helping me study for my SATS. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications from our neighborhood Facebook group, where someone had posted about the BBQ incident, and within hours, there were over 200 comments arguing about whether my wife was a hero or a psycho. Some neighbors who'd seen Sophie with our kids at the park wrote that they'd always thought something seemed off, while others said using a dog as a weapon was insane no matter what. I wanted to reply to every single person spreading lies about my wife being unstable, but the detective told me to stay off social media completely until the case was over. That afternoon, we met with prosecutor Esteban Reardon, who warned us that Sophie's defense would definitely attack my wife's choice to use Zeus instead of calling the police first. He showed us the neighbor's video where you could clearly see Sophie reaching for the butcher knife, and he said that would be their main evidence that my wife faced an immediate threat. He had a list of witnesses ready to testify about seeing Sophie's hand moving toward the knife, including 2 neighbors who'd come running when they heard screaming. The animal control hearing for Zeus was scheduled for the following week, and our lawyer spent hours preparing evidence that Zeus had only followed a legal protection command. We gathered letters from 15 neighbors saying Zeus had never shown aggression before, plus records from his obedience training, showing he scored perfect marks on all safety tests. The vet wrote a statement about Zeus being gentle during exams, and 3 different dog park regulars testified they'd seen him playing safely with their dogs and kids for years. During the hearing, our attorney showed the board that Zeus immediately stopped attacking when my wife commanded him to heel, proving he was under complete control the entire time. Carlos Pike from CPS sent us his updated report saying both kids were showing expected trauma responses but were engaging well with their new therapist. He wrote that Olivia had started talking about what happened in therapy while Ben was using play therapy to process his experiences since he was too young for regular talk therapy. His report recommended keeping the kids in their normal routines as much as possible, continuing therapy with Dr. Bergman, and maintaining the no-contact order with Sophie. Chaya Bergman met with my wife and me together to give us exercises for rebuilding trust as a family, starting with daily 5-minute check-ins where we'd each share one thing we noticed about the other that day. She said the kids needed to see us working as a team because they'd pick up on any tension between us, and she gave us a workbook full of activities to do with them. She explained that Olivia especially needed to see that we believed her and would protect her, while Ben needed consistent routines to feel safe again. 2 weeks later, Sophie's defense attorney filed a motion claiming my wife could have planted the journal since she'd had access to Sophie's overnight bag. The prosecutor countered with evidence that Sophie's fingerprints were on every single page, plus handwriting analysis from an expert who matched it to Sophie's earlier writing samples from birthday cards and letters. The judge seemed annoyed by the defense's motion, especially when the prosecutor showed that some journal entries were written in different colored inks over several months. That night, I sat down with my wife and formally apologized for not listening to her, not just that morning, but every single Thursday when she'd said she felt weird about Sophie babysitting. I told her I wasn't asking for forgiveness because I knew I'd failed our family, but I wanted her to know I saw the pattern now and would never dismiss her instincts again. She cried and said she'd been so scared I'd take Sophie's side, and I held her while we both processed how badly I'd let her down. My parents came over the next day and awkwardly apologized to my wife for calling her a psychopath at the BBQ, with my mother admitting she'd been in denial about Sophie. They said they'd testify for the prosecution if needed, though the prosecutor had already told us he probably wouldn't call them since they hadn't witnessed the actual abuse. The conversation was painful and stilted, with long silences where nobody knew what to say, but it was a start toward fixing our family. At the preliminary hearing 3 weeks later, Detective Wainwright presented a detailed timeline showing exactly when each video was created based on metadata, proving they matched the dates Sophie babysat. Ramona Conrad submitted her report about the forensic interviews with the kids, and the judge allowed it as evidence, even though the defense objected. Sophie's attorney stood up and started arguing that my wife planned the whole attack since Zeus only responds to specific commands from trained handlers. He kept pointing at my wife and saying she could have called the police instead of using a trained attack dog against her sister-in-law. The prosecutor pulled up the neighbor's cell phone video on the courtroom screen, showing Sophie's hand clearly moving toward the knife on the picnic table. Everyone in the courtroom leaned forward, watching Sophie's fingers wrap around the handle, while my wife stood frozen 10 feet away. The judge wrote notes as the video played 3 times, showing the exact moment Sophie grabbed the knife before I kicked it away. The prosecutor explained that my wife faced an immediate threat with a weapon within Sophie's reach, and children nearby who needed protection. The judge nodded and said the evidence clearly showed Sophie reaching for a deadly weapon, which created reasonable fear of imminent harm. 2 days later, we were back in court as the prosecutor opened a cardboard box full of photos from Sophie's storage unit. He spread them across the evidence table, showing a fully furnished child's bedroom with our kids' stolen toys arranged on shelves. The receipts showed Sophie paid 6 months in advance for the unit 3 months before we ever asked her to babysit. There were copies of our house keys hanging on hooks labeled with our address and alarm code written on index cards. evidence. The judge's face got harder with each photo, especially the ones showing our children's school uniforms laid out on the bed. Sophie's attorney tried arguing anyone could have planted those items, but the storage facility manager testified that only Sophie had access. The security footage showed Sophie visiting the unit every week, always carrying bags from our house after babysitting. The judge examined Sophie's journal again, while her attorney filed another motion claiming my wife could have forged the entries. The prosecutor brought in a handwriting expert who matched the writing to Sophie's job applications and rental agreements from years ago. The fingerprint analyst showed the court how Sophie's prints appeared on every single page in the exact pattern of someone writing. The judge looked annoyed and denied the motion, stating that multiple forms of evidence confirmed the journal's authenticity beyond reasonable doubt. She specifically noted that the different colored inks and wear patterns proved the journal was written over many months. The prosecutor met with Sophie's attorney in a conference room while we waited in the hallway with our victim advocate. After 2 hours, they called us in and explained they were offering Sophie a deal to avoid federal charges. She would plead guilty to all state charges and get 15 years with mandatory psychological treatment and lifetime sex offender registration. The deal included permanent no-contact orders with any minors, and she would waive all civil claims about the dog attack. Sophie's attorney said he needed time to discuss it with his client, but the prosecutor said the offer expired at 5 p.m. We watched Sophie's attorney walk to the holding area looking defeated while carrying a thick folder of additional evidence. The next morning, Sophie appeared in court wearing an orange jumpsuit with her arm still in a sling from Zeus's bite. Her attorney announced she would accept the plea agreement, and the judge scheduled the formal plea hearing for the following week. During the allocution, Sophie stood at the podium and read from a prepared statement admitting to the acts against our children. She claimed she never meant to hurt them and that she loved them, which made me want to vomit right there. The judge accepted the plea and sentenced her to 15 years with no possibility of early release for 5 years minimum. Meanwhile, we had to deal with animal control since Zeus had bitten someone badly enough to require surgery and ongoing treatment. The hearing officer reviewed all the evidence, including the video of Sophie reaching for the knife and testimony from the dog trainer. They decided Zeus could stay with us, but had to wear a muzzle in public and complete an additional training course. We also had to maintain a $1 million liability insurance policy and submit to quarterly home inspections for 2 years. Sophie's fingerprints on every page plus different colored inks over months seems pretty hard to fake, but what gets me curious is how she paid 6 months ahead for that storage unit before even babysitting. The trainer said Zeus did exactly what he was trained to do by protecting family members from an immediate threat. 3 weeks after Sophie's sentencing, the district attorney's office sent us a letter formally clearing my wife of all criminal charges. They wrote that she acted in reasonable defense of others facing imminent harm from someone reaching for a weapon. The relief hit us both so hard that we just sat on the couch crying and holding each other for an hour. We knew some people would always judge her for commanding Zeus to attack, but the law said she protected our children. The kids kept going to therapy with Dr. Bergman twice a week, and she gave us daily exercises to rebuild their sense of safety. Ben started sleeping through the night again after 2 months of waking up screaming about bad dreams. Olivia slowly started being okay with us leaving the room without panicking that we wouldn't come back. These tiny improvements felt huge after watching them both regress so much right after finding out about the abuse. Dr. Bergman said healing would take years, but these small victories showed their resilience and the therapy was working. My parents signed up for a grandparent boundaries course that CPS recommended before they could have supervised visits. They spent 6 weeks learning about trauma responses and how to support abuse survivors without causing more harm. The instructor made them practice specific phrases and responses until they could handle the kids' potential triggers properly. Their first supervised visit happened at a community center with a social worker watching everything they did and said. The kids seemed happy to see them, but kept looking at us for permission before hugging them or answering questions. My wife and I started couples therapy to work through the crisis and our broken communication patterns that let it happen. The therapist made us do daily 5-minute check-ins where we couldn't talk about kids or work, just us. We had to tell each other one thing we noticed about the other person that day, even small stuff. She said the attack crisis showed deeper problems about me dismissing my wife's concerns and not making her feel heard. We made a rule that any worry or weird feeling got immediate attention with no brushing it off for later. 2 weeks later, HR called me into a meeting about reporters trying to contact my co-workers about the incident. They'd already turned away 3 different journalists who showed up at the office pretending to be clients, and one had even called our receptionist claiming to be from a vendor we work with. The HR director showed me a company-wide email they were sending out that said any employee who got contacted about personal matters should report it immediately and security would handle it. She also gave me a special badge that would let me use the executive entrance to avoid anyone waiting in the main lobby. The next morning, I found a reporter sitting in her car outside our house, taking pictures of my wife loading the kids into the car for school. I walked over and took photos of her license plate while she rolled up her window and drove off fast, but she was back again that afternoon parked across the street. We called called the police non-emergency line, and they sent an officer to tell her she couldn't park there without being a resident, though we knew she'd probably just move to the next block over. The security company came that weekend to install cameras on every corner of our house, plus motion sensors that would alert our phones if anyone came onto our property. The installer showed us how to do monthly sweeps for hidden devices using a special scanner that would beep if it found any cameras or microphones that shouldn't be there. We had the kids help pick out new stuff for their rooms to make them feel safe again, and Olivia chose purple curtains with stars, while Ben wanted dinosaur wall stickers. They seemed excited about redecorating, but I noticed Olivia kept checking that her new curtains fully covered the window, and Ben asked if bad people could see through walls. My wife and I took turns doing the device sweeps every month, running the scanner along every wall and piece of furniture while the kids were at the school. 4 months after that terrible BBQ, we decided to try having a small family dinner with just my parents and brother-in-law. My mom brought a casserole, and my dad helped set the table while trying not to stare at Zeus, who was wearing his required muzzle but wagging his tail. The kids seemed happy to see their grandparents, and Ben even showed them his new dinosaur collection, though he stayed close to my wife the whole time. We ate dinner and talked about normal things like the weather and my brother-in-law's new job, nobody mentioning Sophie or what happened. Zeus stayed by my feet the whole meal, and when the kids asked if they could give him treats, we let them feed him through the muzzle's special opening. After my parents left that evening, I found my wife standing in the kitchen loading the dishwasher with tears running down her face. I wrapped my arms around her and thanked her again for protecting our children when I'd failed to listen to her concerns that morning. She squeezed my hand and told me we were getting through it together without needing any big speeches about being heroes or anything. The protective orders against Sophie would stay active for years according to the prosecutor, and she was serving her sentence with no chance of early release for at least 5 years. We'd explained to the kids in simple terms that Aunt Sophie was sick and had to go away to get help, and that she could never come near them again. They seemed to understand that they were safe now, and that was really all that mattered to us. Therapy kept going for all of us, and Dr. Bergman said we were functioning well as a family with our new boundaries and communication rules. My parents had to follow strict rules about visits, but they respected them, and we were slowly starting to trust them again, with supervised time with the kids. The kids were actually doing better than we expected, with Olivia joining an art class at the community center, where she painted pictures of flowers and houses. Ben started playing preschool soccer and would run around the backyard practicing his kicks, while Zeus watched from behind the fence. They still had bad days where Olivia would cry about nothing or Ben would wet the bed, but they laughed more now, and that sound made everything else worth it. 6 months from that horrible BBQ, we definitely weren't over what happened, because you don't just get over something like this, but we were living good lives with the kids protected, and Sophie unable to hurt anyone else while she served her time. My wife and I had grown stronger as a couple through the therapy and daily check-ins, and Zeus was still the best dog even with his muzzle at the park. The other dog owners understood once they heard he was a trained protection dog, and most of them said they'd have done the same thing to protect their kids. Our new normal wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and we were making it work one day at a time. Thanks for sticking with me through all my questions and wonderings. It's always so interesting exploring this stuff together. Until we meet again, take care. Subscribe for more content like this.